Thank you, Richard, for reading that and for putting into it the expression that's in the passage. It's a tough passage to read, actually. Almost at times a diatribe against friends and even against God. And we're going to explore some of this passage today, along with some other themes from the book of Job. In fact, this week and next week are something of a double bill, an unusual double bill, grief and wisdom. Now, if that doesn't sound like they go together necessarily, I just want to say we can process questions of suffering in different ways that overlap. There's the sort of pragmatic pastoral concern for people who are grieving, and then there's questions around the truth of what's going on. And so these two things, they're not at odds and they're not totally separate. They overlap. But actually, if you look at the book of Ephesians, we're called to speak the truth in love. There's those two things, the truth and the pastoral concern. Jesus came full of grace and truth. These two things are not exactly the same. So today, if I leave a few theological elephants lying around in the room, please hold off till next week. I do plan to address some of them next week, but I did have to split it up somehow. So this week we'll largely be looking at the pastoral side of things, of how we are around people who are grieving and how we grieve. And then next week we'll look a little bit at some of the questions around true wisdom and suffering. Just before we go into that, I know that you're probably itching for some interaction. So we've got a quick poll. It'd just be nice to know how you guys are doing. So Dan, would you mind just quickly running that poll for us? That would be great. Great. Okay, if your screen's too small to see, about 10% of people really struggling. And then of the remainder, about half and half between doing pretty well, thanks, and others have got it worse. That's great. Thank you. It's good to know. And you've also played totally into my hands for later, which I will fill you in on as we go. So Tim very carefully laid out for us a sort of great introduction of framing to the book of Job last week. And one of the things that he said, and if you haven't listened to it, by the way, please do. If you were out with the history makers or couldn't make it last week, it's available on the website and on the YouTube channel. It's really, really worth listening to what Tim shared, and do set aside some time for it. One of the things he mentioned is the genre of Job, that almost all of it is written in poetry, and that makes a difference to how we read it. Some things can't be taught, but can be learned. So what do I mean by that? There are some things that it's a bit of a nightmare for somebody who's teaching, actually. You think there's no way I can bring you to total comprehension on this. There's no way I myself can totally comprehend it, but we can still learn it. Tim already mentioned that poetry invites us onto a personal journey. It invites personal engagement. I want to build on that and say, in addition, poetry captures mystery. And I use that word in its strict theological sense. It's not sort of Scooby-Doo and who's behind the mask. We're talking mystery in the sense of something deep and true about God that we will not ever fully comprehend. Or perhaps some of these mysteries we will comprehend one day when we're face to face. But I suspect many of them we will go on growing in understanding of throughout eternity as we start to plumb the depths of who God is. There are mysteries that are intentionally left that way because if God is God, it's true and right that he is totally beyond our understanding in some regards. And poetry invites us into that mystery. The idea is not to fully comprehend and to strip it down to bullet points and have it nicely framed in our minds. This is what this poetry is and does and means. The idea is to come to it and be shaped again and again and again. I want to give you an example from some earthly poetry. You might know the poem Ozymandias. Ozymandias by Shelley. You could summarize it, if you had to, as perhaps something like nothing of human origin lasts forever, or proud boasts always prove to be empty. But both of them lack the power of the poem. Let me just quickly read you the poem and see if you capture something of this fallen grandeur that it speaks to. I met a traveller from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things. The hand that mocked them and the heart that fed, and on the pedestal these words appear, my name is Ozymandias, King of kings, look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. You see, just in that short passage of poetry, it invites you into something of that mystery of how somebody can seem to have the whole world under them, and yet in just a short time it all crumbles and disappears. And that sense of loss and arrogance and misplaced pride, all captured in there. This is part of our experience as we read Job. We are expecting to come to it not just to comprehend and not to build a framework for how we process grief or suffering, or so that we can give a snappy answer to somebody. We come to it to be changed by God's wisdom. And there's one particular part of the book of Job that's quite helpful with this. And this is the character Elihu, who is introduced about halfway through between the friends' dialogues and when God speaks. And Elihu is introduced with, he gets a genealogy, but no other sort of intro. We don't know if he's one of Job's friends. We don't know where he came from, when he showed up. And unlike the friends, we don't get God's perspective on what he shared. God doesn't say, listen, you didn't speak right of me, like Job, which he says to the other three friends. And so we're left wondering, is Elihu speaking true wisdom? Is it the voice of God kind of prepping Job? Is it another sort of futile voice lacking wisdom? And actually the most compelling answer that I have found, I don't know if there necessarily is a fixed answer to this, but the most compelling answer I found is that Elihu is partly the voice of the reader. He sort of gets it. He reminds us a bit of us. He has good but ultimately flawed theology, good but flawed wisdom and insight. And as a result, he says a lot that's true, and yet still he clearly has a lot to learn. And as you read through Elihu's speech, and I would encourage you to do that this week, you probably find yourself thinking, oh, you just missed it there. And I think there's a prompt in that. As you would counsel Elihu, counsel yourself. That's a really good exercise in learning how to engage in this poetry and learn from it. Think, what would you say to this character? How would you, with the full perspective of the scriptures that you have, how would you counsel them? And maybe there's a word in that for you as well. I want to suggest that Job's grief raises three main questions. These are questions I found myself processing. There'll be others, I'm sure, but three questions around grief. And they are, first of all, is Job right to grieve? And secondly, is Job's grieving right? And then thirdly, what do we make of his friends' responses to that? So starting off then with the first of that, is Job right to grieve? Now, Tim set a scene last week, a fantastic scene. He said, God has backed Job and staked some of his glory in the heavenly realms on Job's response. Satan's challenged him and said, Job's not a true worshipper. He just likes you because you're good to him. And God says, no, you'll see. And he puts it on Job and he says, Job, my honor's resting on your response here. And the question I find myself asking is, does Job let him down? Does Job let him down? Is Job wrong to grieve as he does? Now, people sometimes struggle to justify grief, particularly if it's lower on the scale. So that poll where I said you'd played into my hands, I have found myself saying, oh, well, others have got it worse. And in that process, by making comparison with other people, I've negated any of the validity of my own feelings. Perhaps you've noticed yourself doing the same. We so often live in comparisons, not in absolutes. That's not how God made us to live. And it's very rarely how God wants us to operate, actually, in comparison to others. We might find ourselves even saying that with relation to grief. Have you ever heard, oh, well, at least they lived to a good age. They had a good innings. At least they didn't suffer if somebody was killed sort of instantly. In some parts of the world, this happens every day. These are all phrases I've heard people talking about with relation to grief that they're experiencing. But the fact is that doesn't make it any easier. The fact that somebody else has it harder doesn't make it any easier. And sometimes we can struggle to justify grief for different reasons. In addition to that, as believers, we perhaps have this extra barrier to get over because there's sometimes a perceived pressure to live in this constant state of positivity. I shouldn't feel like this. Actually, I would say the church generally, certainly the Protestant church, and in particular, maybe the evangelical Protestant church, is very good at celebration and at declaring truth. but we don't do much by way of lamenting. Now, I think that lamenting can be overdone. I'm not suggesting that we should be morose the whole time, but actually, who is our model for our behavior? Who is the one we look to above all others as the example of how we as human beings should live? It's Jesus Christ. Did Jesus ever grieve? Absolutely he did. He was coming to Jerusalem and he looked out over Jerusalem and he wept over Jerusalem, because that city that he was so invested in, well before his earthly incarnation, he was invested in that city and he had poured his love into that city and he had guided that city, and he looks out over it and he knows what's coming and how they'll reject him and what the consequences will be, and he grieves in his heart. What about Gethsemane? God, if it's possible, take this cup away from me. And there he is in such dire distress that his sweat contains blood. What about on the cross as he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Is there grief in that? Absolutely there is. If Jesus can grieve, so can we. And actually, perhaps most powerfully here, if you think about Jesus at Lazarus's grave, Jesus weeps there. Now, we know for a fact that several days beforehand, Jesus knows that Lazarus is going to die and that he's going there to raise him from the dead. And he arrives and he knows that in a couple of hours, he will have gone to the grave and raised Lazarus from the dead, and all of that mourning will be turned to joy. And yet, in spite of all of that, he still grieves. And this points us to a truth that the outcome doesn't negate the grieving. And this is important for us. Jesus knows he's going to raise Lazarus, and yet he can still grieve with Martha and Mary because they are grieving. Now, we as Christians know that one day God will dispense with all tears and sorrow. He will do away with death and sickness and pain, but that does not mean that we cannot grieve now. In fact, quite the opposite. God grieves with those who grieve. He mourns with those who mourn. Job is right to grieve, and we can grieve as well. We don't need to justify that. We don't need to put on a pretense that it's all okay, or make perhaps that slightly more theological false assumption that because one day God will make it all okay, that means that we have to feel positive all the time. Perhaps the deeper question, though, is this: is Job's grieving right? Now, this brings us back to the passage that Rich read for us so wonderfully just now, because Job lays some really serious accusations at God's feet. He says, God has wronged me. He says, there is no justice. I cry out, I've been wronged and there is no justice. That's not my paraphrase, those are the exact words. That's a serious accusation to lay at the feet of the judge of the whole earth. You imagine that you go into a courtroom, and when the judge is sitting there, you say, there is no justice. You're essentially making an accusation directly at that judge, saying you are not doing your job, you are not fit to serve. And this is what Job seems to be saying. So is Job's grieving right? Now, to help us to understand this and to do a little bit of compare and contrast, I'd like to play you a clip of Stephen Fry processing what I suspect is probably some grief of his own, but certainly some of the outcome of his own musings on the question of God. It comes with a health warning. It's not for the faint of heart. He's very strong in his language, but so is Job. And so we'll watch this, 50 seconds of it, and then I want to talk some more about how Stephen Fry has processed this and how Job processes it. Dan, if you could run that video, please.
Suppose what Oscar believed in as he died, in spite of your protestations, suppose it's all true, and you walk up to the pearly gates and you are confronted by God. What will Stephen Fry say to him, her, or it?
I will basically, what's known as theodicy, I think. I'll say bone cancer in children? What's that about? How dare you? How dare you create a world in which there is such misery that is not our fault? It's not right. It's utterly, utterly evil. Why should I respect a capricious, mean-minded, stupid God who creates a world which is so full of injustice and pain? That's what I'd say.
And you think you're going to get in on
No,
that?
but I wouldn't want to. I wouldn't want to get in on his terms. They're wrong. Now,
on the face of things, we're actually seeing two similar responses. There's all this evil in the world. It's not being dealt with by a God who supposedly is powerful enough to deal with it. That's wrong. It's not right. And yet there's such a difference in spirit between reading Job's words and hearing those words from Stephen Fry. And if those produce a strong reaction in you, good, because they should do. They're angry words directed in malice against the Almighty God. But what is the difference between the two? I want to suggest Job's response in Job 19, and if you want to open your Bibles there to the passage that Rich read for us, then please do. Job's response in Job 19 actually has another parallel in the scriptures in Lamentations chapter 3. In Lamentations 3, Jeremiah, we believe, wrote Lamentations. He says, God, you've ground my face in the dirt, in the gravel, all my teeth are broken. He paints this picture of God having sort of really just broken him and his people. And then he says, but this I call to mind and I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we're not consumed. His mercies are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. That passage that we quote so often, that's inspired hymns, comes out of this place of accusation to God of what God has done, of this place of sort of wrestling with God as to why have you done this to me? And yet then he comes out with this beautiful statement about what God has done as well, that his mercies are new every morning. What does Job say off the back of that angry passage we read? He's just said, have pity on me, my friends, have pity, for the hand of God has struck me. Why do you pursue me as God does? Will you never get enough of my flesh? Oh, that my words were recorded, that they were written on a scroll, that they were inscribed with an iron tool on lead, or engraved in rock forever. I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see him with my own eyes, I and not another. How my heart yearns within me. And here we see the difference. Stephen Fry says, I don't want to get in on his terms. Job says, despite all of this, despite the fact that I feel like I've been wronged by God, I yearn to be with God. He yearns for him in the middle of all of this struggle. It's a bit like when the father whose son is being troubled by a demon comes to Jesus and he says, I believe, help me in my unbelief. It's this wrestling. In this wrestling, Job does still honor and worship God, but he's just honest with God about what he's actually feeling. If there's something from this we can learn about how we handle grief, it's that we should have the integrity to admit to God what we feel. He knows it anyway. When God calls out to Adam in the garden and says, Adam, where are you? It's not because he doesn't know. It's because he doesn't want Adam to put up any pretense between him and God. And we find the same with Job. Job says some angry words to God, but he's opening his heart, and his heart is still one of worship. In the midst of pouring out whatever we truly feel, whether it's about the current situation you're in, whether it's about loved ones you've lost, whether it's about the example Tim gave last week of his friend whose life has been blighted by disability. Whatever it is you're calling out to, in the middle of that, you can still call out to God and yearn for him. And Job lays out a way for us to do that. If you can't get your head around that, and I can't fully, it is a mystery. It has something to do with our frailty as humans and God's knowledge of that frailty. We can grieve and worship at the same time. What do we make of Job's friends in all of this? Well, they start off just by being silent, and actually that's probably the best thing they do. I have to say I probably agree with Tim that silence appears to have come out of a total bankruptcy, but actually they sit with him, they're present with him. They do at least make that journey to go and be with him. In coming up to this talk, I spent some time talking with a really good friend of Caroline and I's called Keith. We've spoken about him before. He lost his wife, Eileen, just this year to breast cancer. But he and Eileen also lost their second child, a lovely boy called Jonathan, to cot death when he was very young. And so I spent some time asking him from his experience. He's a headmaster by trade, but he's also been a pastor and a pastoral leader for many, many years. And I asked him what his thoughts were on how people can be with those who are grieving. He said, look, it's okay not to know what to say. So many people don't know what to say. And the answer to that is not to do what some of their friends did when they lost their child and crossed the street to avoid speaking to them, but just to admit it. It's okay to say, I'm so sorry for your loss. I don't know what to say. I wish there was something I could do. That's all right. It's honest, and you're being there with them. Job's friends in that regard are actually quite helpful. Their silence is quite helpful. Just another practical thing as well, dialogue puts people on the spot, and we actually see that coming here. Job's friends' attempt to engage with him actually end up pushing him more and more into a corner, and he has to process what they're saying and how he feels all in one go. Actually, sometimes writing a card, it wasn't necessarily an option for Job's friends, but it is for us. Writing a card or a letter can be much more helpful, because somebody can pick it up and they can read it, and if it's too much, they can put it down again. They can choose when they read it. They could have a drawer full of things that they haven't read 6 months later, or they could read it all the next day. But just taking some time to put down your thoughts, love, perhaps memories of somebody who's been, who's passed away, somebody they've lost, putting them down in writing can be a really precious thing. Remembering that it's all for the benefit of the griever and not for your benefit. And that really comes to the second reflection on the friends, because the friends are far more concerned with justifying themselves and their own honor and their own wisdom and being right. So Zophar, just in chapter 20, just after the passage we read, Zophar the Naamathite replied, "My troubled thoughts prompt me to answer because I'm greatly disturbed. I hear a rebuke that dishonors me. My understanding inspires me to reply." What's he concerned there? He's concerned that somehow he's looked bad in this interaction and he's got to justify himself. And he's concerned that perhaps somebody might think that he's wrong. And goodness me, that's not okay, is it? That won't do. And so he continues to speak words that hurt Job. And this comes back again to not crossing the street to avoid the conversation. We might feel awkward around people who are grieving, particularly if we haven't experienced that same kind of grief that they are themselves experiencing. But our awkwardness should not be a barrier to us showing love. Many times people would rather receive love with a little bit of awkwardness than silence, or sort of conceited words. Let's make sure that when we are with people who are grieving, our focus is on blessing them and not on how we feel. And in fact, this focus on how they might feel is another thing that Job's friends clearly lack. They have no empathy. They make no attempt to consider how Job feels. Actually, even when we totally disagree with somebody, and in this case, Job's friends do disagree with him, even when we totally disagree with somebody, empathy matters. Lacking empathy sets us up as enemies of the person we're speaking to. We're on opposite sides of the table arguing against. The moment you exercise empathy and seek to understand how somebody feels, even if you disagree, you move around to the same side of the table and you work on something together. Job's words at the beginning of that passage that Rich read, "How long will you torment me and crush me with words? 10 times now you've reproached me. Shamelessly you attack me." These are the words of somebody who he knows he's not being understood. There is no attempt being made to understand how he feels. His friends lack endurance as well. In Job 6, he says this, "My brothers are as undependable as intermittent streams, as the streams that overflow when darkened by thawing ice and swollen with melting snow, but that stop flowing in the dry season, and in the heat vanish from their channels. Caravans turn aside from their routes, they go off into the wasteland and perish." Job's friends are not dependable and they don't stick with him. This is really important as well, because when something's in the news, we hear about it, don't we, for the first day or 2 days perhaps, and then it goes out of the news and almost everybody forgets about it, apart from the people who are closest to it. And it can be the same with grief. When we first hear that somebody's been bereaved, or that they've had some really bad news, or perhaps they've lost their job, whatever that grief might be around, there's an initial response of wanting to be there for them, but then it starts to fade. And 2 months down the line, when the shock's over, but the loss has set in, they find themselves isolated and alone. There's a call for us to be enduring friends who are still there in 2 months' time, who in 6 months' time still invite them over for dinner, who send cards or maybe just give a phone call a year afterwards on the anniversary, or whatever it might be. There's a call to be enduring friends. There's a call to patience as well. Job's friends lack patience. They see something they don't like in Job's response and they jump on him for it. Do we make allowance for other people's weaknesses, particularly when they're at their extremity? If God can do so, and he does, because he says to his friends, "You've not spoken right of me as my servant Job has." So God accepts what Job has said in the bulk of it, despite there being some false statements in there. If God can do that, we can also have patience. Clearly, Job's friends lack wisdom. We'll talk more about that next week. I just want to close, though, with one thought, which is this. This is all Old Testament. And sometimes we look at the Old Testament and we say, okay, well, that's all very well, but now we have Jesus. How does that change things? We've said, yes, Job should grieve. And the way that he grieves is not necessarily wrong because he's open with God. And we say that his friends have not adequately and not adequately helped him in his grief. But how has this all changed now that we see Jesus? Aren't we now in an era of sort of undeniable hope, certain resurrection bought with the blood of Christ? Doesn't that take us from victory to victory, glory to glory, and sort of unending triumphal ruling in life? Those are all phrases from the scriptures. But the answer is no, there is still a legitimate place for suffering and for grieving in that new order of things. We do have a more perfect revelation of God in Jesus Christ. We have the perfect revelation of God in Jesus Christ, but that does not change the fact that there's a place for suffering. All it does is it clarifies the purpose of that suffering. Tim mentioned last week that Job never gets to see what goes on in the throne room. He never gets to see that his suffering and the way that he processes it glorifies God. But with Christ, we do see that. Because what was foreshadowed in the patriarchs' lives and what's implied in the prophets is fully demonstrated in Jesus Christ's suffering and death for us. Looking forward to his death in John 12, Jesus says, "Now my soul is troubled. What shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? No, it was for this very reason that I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name." Jesus comes face to face with suffering, and his response is not, "Take me out of this suffering," but "God, bring yourself glory through this." Are we willing to allow our suffering and our grieving to glorify God? Stephen Fry and Job both experienced some degree of grief, and they've processed it. One of them has spoken evil about God, and one of them has spoken words which we still go back to now in order to learn more about God and better glorify him. Paul writes this in 1 Corinthians 4. "For it seems to me that God has put us apostles on display at the end of the procession, like those condemned to die in the arena. We have been made a spectacle to the whole universe, to angels as well as to human beings. We are fools for Christ, though you are so wise in Christ." He's being a bit sarcastic there to his recipients. "We are weak, but you are strong. You are honored, we are dishonored. To this very hour, we go hungry and thirsty. We are in rags. We are brutally treated. We are homeless. We work hard with our own hands. And when we are cursed, we bless. When we are persecuted, we endure it. When we are slandered, we answer kindly. We have become the scum of the earth, the garbage of this world, right up to this moment." And in his second letter to the Corinthians, he builds on this and he says this: "We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. So I want to finish with the question, are we willing to allow our response to suffering and grief to serve to glorify God? All of heaven is watching.